Before a conversation about the Bijuu can even really start, there is one idea that we need to address. That's Kurama implying that strength equals tail count, so let's look at the actual statement. Here are two different translations. To paraphrase, Kurama is saying that Gyuki should be the second strongest Bijuu after him because he has the second most tails. In other words, Kurama thinks he's the strongest Bijuu and he knows Gyuki has the second most tails, so he comes to the conclusion that tails must equal strength for every Bijuu. We'll get to Kurama's strength later, and we all know Gyuki has 8 tails, but even if those parts of the statement are true, they have no logical bearing on the rest of the Bijuu. That's why Kurama phrases the statement as a rhetorical question, and that's why Gyuki immediately calls him out in the literal next panel. According to the 8 tails, not only is Kurama biased and possibly wrong, there's even a specific Bijuu who really hates this line of reasoning. So humor me for a minute. Instead of making the same leap in logic as Kurama, let's look at what's presented in the story and see if we can actually learn about how the tailed beast work. When you think about it, the Bijuu may be the most important set piece in all of Naruto. Every major historical event involves them in some capacity. After a portion of Kaguya's chakra dispersed into her 2 children, she rampaged in the form of the 10 tails. After that, when Hagoromo chose Ashura as his heir, he split that same Jubi into 10 portions. Then when the ninja village system was formed, the League brokered a treaty using those same Bijuu as collateral, and then on top of that, the entire second half of Naruto centers around the Akatsuki, whose central goal is to collect these Bijuu. So because the tailed beasts are so relevant for so long, there are of course a bunch of statements regarding them that bring up questions. For example, on a meta level, because only Shikaku and Kurama are present in part 1, some argue that the rest of this group only exists because they were retroactively added into the story in part 2. There are also a lot of opinions on the term Bijuu level that gets used in the story sometimes. Chojuro calls Kisame the tailless Bijuu, Karin says that Raikage has Bijuu level chakra, and then Madara boasts that his perfect Susanoo rivals the Bijuu. No matter what your opinion on where these 3 characters' scale is, we can all agree that's a pretty wide range. Danzo also makes a statement during 5 Kage Summit that gets brought up pretty often. He groups Hashirama, Madara B, and Yagura together as people who achieve quote-unquote true control over their Bijuu, but only 2 of these people are Jinchuriki, so what does he mean? And what does that mean for people like Minato and the 3rd Raikage who demonstrate the ability to fight Bijuu to some extent? Why aren't they included? What about the Jinchuriki and Deidara's statement on the 3 tails being weaker for not having a host? How does that interact with B's observations on the Jubi being stronger after being sealed into Obito's body? Now that's a lot of questions, but we can definitely answer them over the course of this video. To be clear, I'm going to be ranking the Bijuu in terms of who would win in a fight, so that takes strength, abilities, and intelligence into consideration. When Kurama made his tails equal strength comment, he was arguing that Gyuki should be able to beat the other Bijuu in a fight, so I think these factors are a pretty good metric for today. For simplicity's sake, I'll also split the list up into a few tiers so we can get a good impression on which Bijuu should be in the same range. We'll also be talking about notable Jinchuriki as alternate forms, so someone's placement might be influenced by that as well. That aside, let's get started. So we can put 3 Bijuu in this lowest tier. If they're here, they probably suffer from a lack of showings. Maybe they don't get many fights. Or maybe they have some feats, but they just aren't very impressive. The biggest example of this is Chomei, the 7 tails. Not only do we not know a lot about this Bijuu, but the feats that we do get from it just aren't that impressive. This is the only Bijuu who wasn't handed out to the other Kage by Hashirama, according to the 4th data book. We also learn in the war arc that their Jinchuriki was Fu, a waterfall village ninja. The only other ninja from this village that I can remember personally is a random guy that Jiraiya met on his travels who became one of the Paths of Pain, so let me know in the comments if you know anybody else from the waterfall village in the manga. It's also unclear when exactly the Akatsuki caught Chomei or who they sent to capture it in the manga, so it's impossible to say how long it took for them to seal the 7 tails or if catching it was hard or anything. Abilities wise, the 7 tails is the only Bijuu that can fly, and we see Fu use the scaled sneak jutsu, which seems to be a kind of smokescreen. Also, when Naruto uses his Sage Bijuu Rasen Shuriken, I'm pretty sure that's Chomei's chakra being used for the windy looking one, so maybe they have wind style as well. During the fight with Kurama, the 7 tails gets knocked down first after Kurama grabs them out of the air, so we really don't get to see much of them using any of these abilities in a fight. They also participate in the brief scuffle against Madara, but that's a 9v1 and they're just not very prominent there either. The most charitable thing I can say about Chomei is that they don't have that many feats, so we don't know that much about them. And the least charitable thing I can say about Chomei is that Kurama grabbed them in midair while they were charging forward, which is not a good look. Moving on to a Bijuu that has better showings and we actually know a little bit more about, we've got Saiken, the 6 tails. Hashirama gave this Bijuu to the village hidden in the mist, but apparently that did not end well. The Mist had a hard time controlling their Bijuu, and on top of that, Saiken's only shown Jinchuriki, Utakata, actually ended up going rogue. Just like Chomei, we also don't really know when the Akatsuki actually caught Saiken in the manga, so there's no point of reference for fights or ceiling time there. The main reason I have Saiken above Chomei is because it shows a wider range of abilities and has slightly better showings, but they're really interchangeable. In their fight against Kakashi and Guy, the Six Tails uses a corrosive gas that withers a nearby tree. Unfortunately, this ability does not seem to be very fast at all, and if it's similar to Mei's gas that she uses with lava release, then it's probably at its best in enclosed spaces and not very good anywhere else. Saiken doesn't physically try to hit Madara during the first part of their fight, but they do use some kind of slime to try and immobilize him. We really don't know if this would actually held him for long on its own, as he breaks out of it and Shikaku's sand a few panels later. If you ask me, this seems like the kind of ability that will require you to hit somebody into it or trick them into walking into it, so do with that what you will. Saiken's Rasen Shuriken has gas particles around it, so that's probably more gas if I had to guess. Showing wise, Saiken does last a little bit longer against Kurama than Chomei, but that's really just because Kurama doesn't start with it. When the Six Tails tries to sneak Kurama and eat their arm, Kurama swings them like a battering ram into Matatabi, the Two Tails, so they were having just as hard of a time as Chomei physically against Kurama. Speaking of Matatabi, they're the last Bijuu in this lower tier. Personally, I think having unimpressive showings is better than having no showings at all when both parties have no statements to refer to, so the Two Tails goes above Chomei and Saiken mainly because we've just seen more of it. Hashirama gave Matatabi to the Cloud Village, and it's here that we get one of the few direct comparisons between two Bijuu. Unlike Yuki, who's shown rampaging through the Cloud Village and fighting ninja a few times, the Two Tails is stated to be easier to contain. It's Jinchuriki's Yugito when you actually see Yugito fight against Hidan and Kakuzu, so I'm going to take the opportunity to explain some things about this interaction. For one, Yugito lured these two into an enclosed space so that she could take them out. When she undergoes full transformation, Kakuzu says that she's given herself fully over to her Bijuu, which makes sense. Danzo declined to list her along with B and Yagura when he talked about people who had control over tailed beasts, despite her also being from Kumo, so she probably can't control Matatabi. Even if she could though, we know that full transformation always comes with conditions and time limits. For example, Shikaku can only manifest when his Jinchuriki is asleep, but he seems to be a special case. For people like B and Naruto, their full transformations tend to just have time limits. For example, when Naruto first gets KCM2, he has 5 minutes. With that in mind, there's a case for Yukito's time limit being shorter, but even if it isn't, it definitely exists at the very least. That aside, Kakuzu and Hidan can definitely react to Matatabi. Kakuzu tries to catch its paw and Hidan dodges its fireball. From what we see, it seems pretty possible though that these two could have just dodged the Two Tails until its timer ran out and then beat up Yugito, which brings me to the subject of the Akatsuki and the tailed beast. The third data book describes the members of the Akatsuki as stronger than a Jinchuriki and having a quota of 1 tailed beast each. Let's contextualize that. Assessing the source first, Data Book 3 covers chapters 245 to 403. That's the beginning of Shippuden up to the Itachi reveal. With that in mind, does it really make sense for every member of the Akatsuki to be stronger than every Jinchuriki? Naruto blows Kakuzu up in this chapter range, and B beats up all Otaka who were in the Akatsuki at the time, a few chapters outside of this range. With that in mind, it's not really a good idea to take that part of the statement at face value and use it to make any broad assertions. Sure, in the manga, Hidan and Kakuzu captured Matatabi, Kisame beat Han, and somebody had to capture the 6 and 7 tails, but it's a lot more consistent to say that the Akatsuki have the means of meeting their Bijuu quota and that they're stronger than a Jinchuriki in a general sense, as opposed to the statement being an absolute rule of thumb. In other words, an Akatsuki member needs to have Bijuu level showings or better statements for us to truly assert that they're straight up stronger than the Bijuu, which brings me back to Matatabi. Hidan and Kakuzu may dodge everything the Two Tails does on panel, but they also don't damage Matatabi at all, so you'd have to assume they did somehow as opposed to waiting the timer out. This is important because Matatabi gets hit by Kurama swinging Saikon and immediately recovers and starts forming a Bijuu bomb right after, so you need to prove that Hidan and Kakuzu have some other means of damaging the Two Tails that's different from that. That aside, Matatabi really specializes in fire style. We see them use a fireball against Hidan, and then in the fight against B and Naruto, they use smaller guided fireball missiles as well. Physically against Kurama, they get dealt with just as quickly as Saiken and Chomei do, and they contribute about just as much as the others against Madara. So I think it's safe to put them at the top of this lowest tier, mainly because they have more offensive abilities than these other two, and we've seen them a little bit more than 6 and 7 tails, and they have more feats. If you think Madatabi gets nagged by the water style Saiken probably has, that's pretty fair, but at the end of the day, all three of these Bijuu are on the lower end and are all pretty interchangeable. Moving on, we've got 3 more tail beasts in the second lowest tier. These Bijuu are going to have better showings, better abilities, and maybe even more notable Jinchuriki that we can touch on, so let's start with Isobu, the 3 tails. This Bijuu was the second one given to the mist by Hashirama, but it seems like they had a better time controlling it than Saiken. Despite it being the only Bijuu that didn't have a Jinchuriki in the manga when it fought with the Akatsuki, Isobu actually has 2 notable Jinchuriki, Rin and the 4th Mizukage Yagura. Starting with Rin, we know she was forced to host the 3 tails by the mist. They were trying to make Isobu rampage inside of the village. After she was killed by Kakashi, Isobu would have reformed and came back to life after some time, which brings us to Yagura. So out of all the people mentioned by Danzo in his statement, we know the least about the 4th Mizukage. I mentioned earlier that only 2 of the people shown here are Jinchuriki, but they have to all have something in common. We know Minato and A3 can fight the 8 and 9 tails to some extent, so it can't be combat related, even though Hashirama can beat up the 9 tails and he's on the list. If you ask me, Danzo is talking about methods of control. Madara has the Mangekyo so he can genjutsu Kurama. Hashirama can suppress Kurama's chakra or just outright put him to sleep with his wood style, and B is just friends with Gyuki. Yagura though was held under genjutsu by Obito for a good while, and B says that those with a strong bond with their Bijuu just can't be put under genjutsu. Maybe you think Isobu just kind of sat back and let Yagura get controlled like that out of spite, but that doesn't seem very consistent with the cooperation required to have the genjutsu resistance that comes with being a perfect Jinchuriki, quote unquote. What really makes more sense is that Yagura was just in the earlier stages of mastering his Bijuu. His databook entry says he can completely control Isobu, which is actually the same phrasing that gets used when talking about Naruto when he has KCM 1. People say that he has the 9 tails chakra under control during that part of the story. Naruto doesn't master Kurama until he befriends him against KCM 2. This would explain why Yagura can be included in Danzo's statement but still get controlled by Obito's genjutsu. Leaving Yagura aside though, Isobu himself gets downplayed a little bit because of his interaction with Deidara, so I want to talk about that fight a little bit as well. First, both Toby and Deidara definitely fought the 3 tails. Deidara straight up tells Toby to take the lead, and the next we see of the fight after the cutaway, Toby is asking Deidara if he saw his jutsu, so he clearly helped to some extent with some kind of ability. Second, it's pretty clear that Deidara used Toby to distract the 3 tails and then blew up a bomb right next to its head. That's a textbook sneak attack. There's nothing wrong with that, but we know that people in Naruto fight by amping their bodies with chakra, so an off guard or a strike to an unshielded area tends to hurt more than usual. Third, we cut away from this fight after the first bomb, so we don't know if Deidara blew up anymore after the fact. We know Toby did something for a fact, as I covered earlier, but it doesn't really matter because this fight opens up with Deidara landing an off guard hit, which probably made the rest of the fight much easier for this pair. I say all that to touch on Deidara's statement on the 3 tails being nerfed because they didn't have a Jinchuriki. If we look at the statement, Deidara says that Isobu didn't have enough intellect to control his power. That can mean a few different things. Either the 3 tails didn't have good chakra control, or it was too dumb to fight 2 people at once. The second interpretation actually lines up with the basic distract him and I'll hit him strategy that Deidara and Toby use. This fight would have gone a lot differently if Yagura were there, as cooperating Bijuu and Jinchuriki are described as 2-man cells pretty consistently. Even if these 2 weren't friends, a common enemy might have inspired them to cooperate. That aside, the no Jinchuriki nerf interpretation of this statement needs context, so we'll apply it on a case-by-case basis when it's relevant later on in the video. If a Bijuu already has intellect, Deidara's statement is not going to apply to them even if they don't have a host, because they have the intellect to control their power. Now that we're getting into Bijuu that we know a little bit more about, it's also important to note that Isobu and Matabi took 6 days total to seal. If we assume they took the same amount of time, that's 3 days each, but it also might have been 4 and 2 or 5 and 1, we just don't know. It's pretty fair to say that a Bijuu with more chakra will take longer to seal, so we'll keep that in mind for later. Isobu himself has water style like Saiken, and physically he does look a little bit more impressive than the lowest tier depending on how you interpret the fight with Kurama. After Saiken swallows Kurama's arm, Isobu rolls towards them and gets stopped by Gyuki, which robs us of the chance to see how Kurama was actually going to deal with that attack. Because the roll did get stopped though, we can't really say it was going to do anything crazy, but Isobu's notable Jinchuriki and verifiable amp when inside of Yagura justifies his placement at the bottom of this new tier. Above Isobu we got Kokyo, the Five Tails. Hashirama gave him to Iwa during negotiations, and his Jinchuriki is Han. In the Minato one-shot, we actually see Han and Son Goku fully manifest and charge Bijuu bombs during the Third Great Ninja War. That may seem like a side note, but Matatabi just isn't shown to be able to do this while inside of Yugito, which strengthens the case for the 4 and 5 tails being above them when taking Jinchuriki into consideration. Unlike Isobu and Matatabi, the 5 tails doesn't get sealed by the Akatsuki on screen, and we also don't know who captured them. In terms of abilities, Koko is more of a brawler than any of the other Bijuu, which has good synergy with his main ability, Boil Release, which grants unparalleled physical strength. Han goes from being easily blocked by KCM1 Naruto to overwhelming him, but its best showing comes from Naruto using it to overwhelm one of Kaguya's vacuum fists. This is pretty impressive, but I do think this ability gets slightly overhyped at times in the community. In this situation, it was mainly being used to catch Kaguya by surprise, and while it did overwhelm her, Naruto has 2 other physical showings that don't involve Boil Release that need to get discussed to fully understand how much of an amp Boil Release really is. First, he clashes evenly with a much larger number of fists a few chapters prior. Naruto does get overwhelmed here, but it's definitely not immediate, so even though Kaguya is obviously the stronger of the two, it's not a one-shot difference in terms of physical. She's not just running up to him and punching him. Later on, Naruto straight up rips Kaguya's arm off after Obito dies. I personally think it's pretty fair to call this a mental amp, but it's also blatantly more impressive than knocking her away. My point here is that yes, Boil Release is very powerful, but it's also clear that the physical gap between Naruto and Kaguya wasn't super duper huge night and day, and Naruto can clearly fight her when amped by other things. That aside, it's unclear whether Kokyo uses Boil Release on himself during the fight with Gyuki. There is a sound effect when he goes to hit him, but it's not the same one that's made when Han uses it, so take that as you will. It doesn't really matter because the 5 tails is really physically impressive either way. He does the best against Kurama and Gyuki than anyone I've mentioned so far, being able to gore the 8 tails once before the 8 tails adapts to the attack pattern. His contributions against Madara are pretty run-of-the-mill, but being able to hurt Gyuki alone is enough to have him this high. At the top of this tier though, I've got Son Goku, the 4 tails. Just like Kokyo, he was given to the Stone Village by Hashirama, which solidifies the idea that Iwa got a pretty good deal despite them continuing to seek out other Bijuu after this deal. We don't know how long it took for the Akatsuki to seal him either, but we do know that he and his Jinchuriki Roshi fought against Kisame, which is really good stock for them in my opinion. If you're not aware, Kisame is the literal hard counter to Bijuu, as the more chakra his opponent has, the more he'll be able to steal from them over time. This combined with the water exploding shockwave bubble make him the best in the Akatsuki and live capture, so Son Goku and Roshi losing to him really isn't bad at all. Kisame even comments on his corrosion style being nothing to laugh at, despite him being a water jutsu specialist. Roshi and Goku also blatantly don't have a good relationship, so there's no chance of cooperation between these two at all. Abilities wise, Son Goku uses lava style primarily, which Roshi can cloak himself in to make himself into a juggernaut. Even Naruto can't handle the heat while in KCM1, and they don't even directly touch there. Physically, Goku was also very impressive. The easiest way to understand how impressive he is to understand that Naruto and B fight him at the same time and still have a little bit of trouble. Not only does Gyuki get tossed around twice, Naruto himself gets swallowed and has to use strategy to remove the rods controlling the 4 tails. It's important to note that Kyokyo had already injured Gyuki at this point and Naruto was tired, but these two Bijuu being able to fight the 8 tails pretty well is pretty good for their placements. This same injured Gyuki is able to stop Isobu's roll and Kyoko's second gore with very little difficulty later, so I have Son Goku at the top of this tier for those reasons. Moving past Son Goku, there are 2 Bijuu I'm going to place in the second highest tier. Anybody here is extremely strong and is most likely beating anybody underneath them in a 1v1 pretty easily. So first, let's talk about Gyuki, the 8 tails. Hashirama gave him to Kumo, which was the best deal any of the villages got out of this meeting in terms of sheer combat power. Unlike the Mist, the Cloud Village managed to keep the 8 tails under control reasonably well, probably because of their constant pursuit of military power to complement the Bijuu. Gyuki has 2 notable Jinchuriki. The first shown in the manga, A's cousin wasn't strong enough to control the 8 tails, but B was strong enough to control him like Yagura and kind enough to befriend him eventually. Through their teamwork, they were actually able to avoid getting captured by the Akatsuki outright. They tricked Sasuke, and their fight with Kasame is pretty impressive when you take into consideration that they weren't able to undergo full transformation because they were in hiding. I've already covered this fight with Kisame in another video, but I do want to touch on Kisame's statement on Gyuki's reputation. He says that the Eight Tails lives up to his reputation of being just one tail less than Kurama, which is pretty in line with what Kurama says himself. Because it's such a similar statement, we can pretty much apply the same logic to it. Kisame's fought at least one other Jinchuriki in the manga, that being Son Goku. We don't know if he's fought anybody else, but maybe you could put Saiken and Chome under his belt if you're being generous. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because I agree with the Bijuu that Kisame probably fought being weaker than Gyuki, and he doesn't say anything about how the Bijuu he could have interacted with compared to each other outside of Gyuki. In other words, Kisame affirming Gyuki's reputation as the second strongest lacks some context, but it makes sense that he would say that when you consider what knowledge he has, and it still doesn't dispute that tails may not equal strength. In terms of abilities, Gyuki is the first tail beast to have a different kit depending on whether he has a Jinchuriki or not. By himself, he's shown to use his tentacles in battle, and it's pretty fair to assume that he has ink as B uses it against Kisame, and that is an octopus trait. Physically though, Gyuki can restrain Isubo pretty easily and repel Kyokyo once he's gotten the attack figured out. He may get thrown around by Son Goku, but he was injured at that point and shook off the attacks from the four tails pretty easily afterwards. Speaking of durability, on the highest end, the Eight Tails demonstrates the ability to take some Bijuu bombs from the 10 Tails to some extent, as he actually endures a portion of its laser before Kakashi teleports it and blocks another bomb for a short period of time before Minato teleports it. He did need a break after this, but it's still very, very impressive. Because B is such a notable Jinchuriki, I do want to talk about how his involvement with Gyuki ends up being a buff. For one, we know that Gyuki was wild before meeting him and became calmer over time. When he was inside of B, he actually gained multiple sealing jutsu, with the main one being ink doppelgangers. This jutsu will incapacitate the target in 3 seconds, and it seems to work on the Jinchuriki in their humans forms, but it falls short when they go into V2. Gyuki says that this is one of B's sealing jutsu, so it's technically not an organic Eight Tails ability, just something that B invented during his life, making Gyuki a more adaptable fighter. That aside though, anyone in this tier handily gaps the rest of the Bijuu, and one of the best examples of this is the Madara fight. After Shikaku immobilizes Madara, he gets directly hit by 6 Bijuu, specifically tails 2 through 7, the same ones who fought Naruto and Gyuki. Conveniently enough, they all happen to be beneath this tier. After they hit Madara, he's bloodied up, but he's still able to fight and has all of his limbs. Then Shikaku, Gyuki, and Kurama join in and do a tail stack with the other 6. This time, Madara has his Susanoo up and he straight up loses an arm. This may be a smaller detail, but when you think about it, it's pretty clear that the addition of these 3 Bijuu completely changed the battle. They hurt Madara more, but he had his Susanoo up. Moving on, let's talk about Shikaku, the One Tail. When Hashirama was dividing up the Bijuu between the ninja villages, the Sand was actually in a position of power because they had already been sealing a certain spirit for years, Shikaku. To be clear, the point of this meeting was to create a balance of military powers, Bijuu-based powers, between each country. If things were uneven, the peace that Hashirama was trying to create would fail. In fact, the Mist being unable to control their Bijuu, the Stone looking to capture more, and the Cloud expanding their military power in other ways are all things that undid this balance, proving Hashirama's point. With that in mind, it's obvious that the Sand didn't need any more Bijuu power, so they sold their cooperation for land and money. Just to make things absolutely plain and simple, there are 2 villages that only have 1 Bijuu, the Leaf with Kurama and the Sand with Shikaku. The One Tail has 2 notable Jinchuriki and was friendly with neither. The first was a monk, and despite him being uniquely kind, Shikaku refused to cooperate with him. The second was Gaara, and despite him being a child when he hosted Shikaku, he still rampaged, so no real bust from either of these hosts. During the war arc, Rasa says that he would use magnet style to weigh down the One Tail's Sand during these attacks, which is also very telling as it's basically a hard counter to the ability. His gold was heavier than the Sand, so it would automatically slow down whatever Shikaku would try to do, which is pretty similar to the Leaf finding specific hard counter ways to control their Bijuu, ergo the Uzumaki. We know that the third Kazekage also used magnet release, so it's fair to say that he dealt with the One Tail in the same way. Shikaku's rampages were such a problem because his full transformation time limit is so ambiguous. His Jinchuriki were insomniacs, so when they would finally sleep, Shikaku would be free to rampage as long as they remained unconscious. This is probably why the Sand needed a surefire way to stop him every time he got loose, and why they were able to keep him for so much longer than the other villages. More often, Rampage isn't a surefire method to stop him. On top of that, unlike the Three Tails, Shikaku was perfectly intelligent enough to fight well without a partner, which we see during the war arc. The One Tail has a pretty wide range of abilities. I've touched on the Sand a bunch, but Shikaku also has Magnet Release, which he demonstrates with the Rasengan he helps Naruto with. Because it has its curse markings on it, it's safe to say that the Magnet style is also what allows Shikaku to use Sealing Jutsu, which he also demonstrates against Madara. Basically, imagine the One Tail as a 6 tails that can restrict your movements with his abilities, but then he can actually fight as well with Wind style jutsu like his Sand Bombs and Air Bullets. Moving on, Shikaku's physicals are pretty underrated. Aside from the tail stack that I talked about in the Gyuki section, the One Tail's durability is especially crazy. He manages to block a Susanoo sword projectile from Madara pretty easily. If you're asking why that's important or impressive, this is a version of Madara that's verifiably stronger than the one that fought the 5 Kage, alive and stated to be regaining his past strength buff with Hashirama's Sage Mode and one Rinnegan. And then even further than that, Gaara takes the exact same hit and gets knocked down. We also get some pretty interesting showings from him during the Chunin exams, which definitely need to be explained. First, it's important to note that if Gaara is awake while Shikaku is fully manifested, Shikaku isn't at full strength. Gamabuta says it himself, and that's why he was able to get a slash off on the One Tail to begin with. Even with Shikaku being suppressed though, Gamabuta still struggled to fully cut through his arm, and once Gaara goes to sleep, he immediately tells Naruto to directly go for Gaara because he simply can't fight Shikaku for much longer. Specifically, the air bullets that Shikaku uses hurt Gamabuta badly enough for him to admit that he can't take many more of them. So even though this fight takes place really early on in the manga, it ended up being a showcase of one of the strongest Bijuu retrospectively, which makes some of the Madara stuff more consistent when you think about it that way. The only reason Shikaku gets stopped is because Naruto happens to be sitting on the head of another massive powerful animal that he can also transform into something with claws that can hold Shikaku down long enough for him to go beat up Gaara. The last thing I want to go over with the One Tails is the statement I started this video with. After Kurama says that Gyuki should be the second strongest after him, Gyuki straight up tells him he's wrong and then mentions Shikaku. That combined with Shikaku's better durability, wider range of abilities, and the implications of the power balance are why Shikaku is here. Now that we got everybody else out the way, let's talk about the two-tailed beasts in the absolute highest tier, that being Kurama and the 10 tails. I'm going to do something a little bit different here and talk about these two at the same time because their placement is pretty situational. On Kurama's end, he has 3 notable Jinchuriki, all ninja from the Leaf. The first was Mito Hashirama's wife. She sealed Kurama into herself during her husband's fight with Madara. She also had the ability to sense incoming danger, just like Naruto and KCM, which seems to imply that she might have even had some control over Kurama's chakra maybe. She was an Uzumaki like Kushina and Karin, so there's also a good case for her having the chakra suppressing chains as well. Kushina, on the other hand, was Kurama's second Jinchuriki, and while she didn't have the danger sensing ability that Mito did, she repeatedly shows that she can restrain Kurama, especially as she gets older with those same chains. Now we all know about Naruto, so I'm not going to talk much about his history here, other than to bring up something that Kurama might have learned while he was with him. In the Final Valley, a clone of the Kurama avatar gathers enough nature energy to clash evenly with Sasuke's Indra's arrow, which happened to have the chakra of 8.5 of the other Bijuu, or 1 9 tails half short of the 10 tails. Now, half of the 9 tails is a lot of chakra, but Kurama still gathered enough nature energy to clash evenly with that, which is crazy. We don't really know if Kurama could always do this or if he just learned watching Naruto or something, but it's just the fact that Kurama gets massively stronger while he's with Naruto, which is epitomized by Baryon mode. Before I talk about though, let's talk about the 10 tails for a second. When Kaguya rampaged to reclaim her son's chakra, she did so in the form of the Jubi. After she was sealed, Hagoromo sealed that Jubi inside of himself, then split it up into the Bijuu after he chose Ashura as his heir. During the war arc, we see an incomplete 10 tails completely bully Kurama and Gyuki, half of Kurama that is, together, and almost destroy the entire Ninja Alliance after that, and that's before it even gets sealed inside of anybody. For the 10 tails, being inside of a Jinchuriki is stated to be a buff. Gyuki says that it learned how to focus its power, and we see it destroy the barrier that the Hokage had put up at the time and destroy Hashirama's deity gates on top of that. If the Jinchuriki controls this power further, they gain 6 path Senjutsu and light and shadow styles that negate ninjutsu entirely, so clearly a huge buff. In Boruto, things are currently centered around the fragments of a different juvenile Ten Tails, and we've learned that the God Tree itself forms from feeding a living Otsutsuki to the Ten Tails. That aside, it makes sense to have Kurama by himself below the Ten Tails, but Kurama inside of Naruto and Boruto are definitely beating the Ten Tails from the war arc all the way up. It's not even close. Not only can Naruto just stall the Jubi out with his main body and have a clone do the exact same thing he did against Sasuke in the background, but there's a case for Kurama being able to build twice as much nature energy up, as Naruto now has the full 9 tails after the war. Adult Naruto and Kurama together are also beating both Jubito and Jubidara. We saw a drained Naruto who was restricted to just taijutsu fighting on par with Fused Momoshiki, who was the combination of 2 people who were described to be on Kaguya's level by Sasuke. Kaguya had so much more chakra than Jubidara that Sasuke couldn't even believe it, and Naruto said that the chakra itself was even stronger than the Ten Tails. If that isn't enough for you somehow, Baryon mode Naruto was fighting evenly with Ishiki, who was Kaguya's superior. In other words, Kurama with adult Naruto as his Jinchuriki should unquestionably be at the top of this list, but if he's by himself, there's a case for him being beneath the Jubi, depending on whether you think he can build up nature energy without Naruto making clones for them. All that aside, if you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. Definitely subscribe if you like Naruto videos like this, and let me know in the comments if you'd like to see anything in this category in the future. Other than that, have a good day.